eternal dawn of our penances heralds its imminent end.
Blasphemous II has a lot of upgrades. From health upgrades to weapon memories, which power up your weapons, to rosary beads and figurines, which give all sorts of different buffs, there's no shortage of ways to get stronger. So today I'm going to try to beat the game without any of these. No rosary beads, figurines, health or fervor upgrades, or weapon memories. I'm also going to ban any type of prayer whatsoever, since those are absurdly powerful. And just to make it a bit harder, I'm also going to restrict myself to only using the twin rapiers, Sarmiento and Centella. Sarmiento and Centella, as much as I favor them to the other two weapons, are definitely the worst choice of weapon in the game. It's the fastest weapon out of the three you can choose from, but the damage output is so low it doesn't really matter. Sarmiento and Centella have two special abilities I can use. The first one is a parry. Unfortunately, this isn't the broken parry from Blasphemous I. Without upgrading it, it's pretty much useless. The end lag on this after blocking an attack is insane, so it's almost always a better idea to dodge an attack rather than parry. Its second special ability is probably the rapier's saving grace. After a dodge, you're able to do a dash attack. The attack itself isn't all that great, it doesn't do that much damage and leaves me open to attack when it's over. On the other hand, for the entire animation, you're granted full body invincibility. It doesn't apply to every attack, but it's nice to have against certain enemies. And for one final rule, I'm not going to allow myself to use any bile flasks, just cause I had too much health before. Also, I hid 3 skulls in this video. If you find them all, I'll give you a shout out. And as usual, congrats to Trey3 for finding them in my last video. The hiding places last time were kinda scummy, so good job. Well, that was a long intro, so without any further delay, let's get into the challenge. After waking up in a coffin after the events of Blasphemous I, I used the only forced bile flask in the run. No mercy from now on. I choose the dual rapiers and the other 2 weapons crumble away, and I'm immediately sent into my first boss fight, Faceless One, Chisel of Oblivion. Yeah, this boss is pathetically easy. He only has 2 attacks and they're not very menacing. He goes down on my first try, without being hit. With the first boss defeated, I head through the Ravn of the High Stones, and get to the City of the Blessed Name. This is the game's town, but there's literally nothing I can do here for the entire run, so I head into my next area, Profundo Lamento. At this point, I can't really do much in this area, so I grab the wall climb ability and get out. At this point, there are 3 different areas I can go to. Either I could go to the Sacred Entombments, which holds Radames, the Palace of the Embroideries, which holds Orospina, or the Crown of Towers, which holds Lesmes and Infanta. Out of the 3, Lesmes and Infanta are by far the hardest. And since it's not as if I'm getting any stronger, I head towards the Crown of Towers. Getting through grills and ruins and the Choir of Thorns isn't that bad. Most of the enemies here can be completely avoided, with a couple exceptions who aren't too problematic. Pretty soon I reach the Crown of Towers. Just like in the previous areas, I don't really fight anyone and run past everything instead. You'll see me do this a lot. I don't get anything for killing enemies, so you won't see me killing many unless I'm forced to. I get the second weapon, Ruego al Alba, here, which allows me to break through these walls. Pretty soon I reach Lesmes and Infanta. This is a tough fight. Phases 1 and 2 of this fight aren't too bad. During these phases, you'll fight Lesmes and Infanta separately. Lesmes flies above you and creates fire pillars, while Infanta shoots projectiles at you from afar. Neither of them are all too menacing on their own, but the problem truly starts when you enter Phase 3, where they attack you simultaneously. Infanta is the real problem. While you're trying to avoid Lesmes' fire pillars, Infanta's homing projectiles become a lot harder to dodge. Thankfully, guilt fragments make it a bit easier. Once you die, the Penitent One drops a guilt fragment near that spot. Picking these up heals a tiny bit of health, which is important when I have no other way to heal. The real key to this fight is only focusing on Infanta, since she's a lot more frail than Lesmes. Once she goes down, the fight is pretty much already over. It doesn't fix everything, of course, since it only takes a couple mistakes to be killed. But eventually, I'm able to avoid everything for long enough to kill Infanta. And after 40 minutes of tries, I'm able to take down Lesmes and Infanta. With Lesmes and Infanta defeated, I head to the Palace of the Embroideries to fight Ospina. I can't avoid everything here though, since I encounter the first important enemy challenge room of the run. These don't allow you to progress until you defeat all the enemies, and we'll be seeing them a lot later on. This room has 3 phases. The first one is the most dangerous, with 2 chandelier boneheads spawning. These enemies only have one move, a dashing attack with their chandelier. It wouldn't be that difficult to avoid, but it has a big hitbox behind it, which often caught me off guard. The other 2 phases didn't give me any trouble, so I'm able to fight Ospina, Lady Embroiderer.
Onga.
Ospina is a pretty easy boss on a normal playthrough, but that doesn't mean much given the challenge. The biggest problem is her teleporting attack on the second and final phase. For some reason I couldn't get it in my head to just duck, and I kept on being hit by it by trying to roll through it. Aside from that though, this fight is pretty easy, and I take her down in a couple attempts. With Ospina defeated, the only boss left to defeat is Radames. Radames resides in the Sacred Entombments, which I'm able to make it to pretty quickly through the Aqueduct of the Costales. In here I'm able to get the final weapon, Benedicta, which allows me to ring these bells to access new areas. I don't have too many issues making my way through the Sacred Entombments, aside from a lot of waiting. There's also only one enemy challenge room here, and it just has 2 bell carriers, which I deal with pretty quickly. And with that, I head to fight the final boss of the trio, Great Preceptor Radames. You know, this is probably the easiest boss in the game. Anyway, before I go to the next area, I first need the skill for double jump. To get this, I have to get to beneath her sacred grounds, which has me go through the Mother of Mothers from Blasphemous I. I get scarily close to dying here, but I'm able to make it through without dying, and make it to beneath her sacred grounds, to fight the next boss, Ahahahaha, Sentinel of the Emery. This boss is usually pretty easy, and this challenge doesn't change that, as I'm able to beat him in 7 tries, after a 4-minute fight. With Ahahahaha defeated and a double jump acquired, my next destination is the Elevated Temples. You know the drill, just run past everything in sight. Is what I would say if this area didn't have the most enemy challenge rooms thus far, at 3. The first 2 aren't too challenging. We do meet a stronger chandelier bonehead here, but for some reason, they just stand there after they spawn. I won't complain. The final room is by far the hardest of the 3. The third phase in particular has a Thurible Enjoyer? I have no clue if these are official names, to be honest. This video is the only place I found names, so 100% guides, my life is in your hands. Anyway, a Thurible Enjoyer and a Nightcaster spawn here. The Nightcaster is the real problem here. If I'm too far away from him, he'll summon these energy balls which home in on me, which are really difficult to dodge. He's also way too bulky for me to kill him before the Thurible man gets to me. Thankfully, this room has these mirrors in it that I can teleport through by hitting them. I'm able to use them to slowly whittle down the Thurible fella, while avoiding the Nightcaster's projectiles. On his own, the Nightcaster is a lot easier to deal with. The last phase only has an incense hammer and a red lamp, and once they're defeated, I make it to the Chapel of the 5 Doves. From visiting here, this bridge appears in the Crown of Towers, and I'm able to get the ability Mercy of the Wind. This is by far the most useful ability in the game, since it gives me an invincible air dash, which unlike my normal dodge, is invincible to everything. It also lets me go through these blue chains, which I guess is nice. And with that, I enter the Basilica of Absent Faces. In the Basilica of Absent Faces, I'm quickly faced with another challenge room. The first phase isn't too difficult, just spawning some flying paintings that I take care of pretty quickly. The second phase is a lot more challenging. This phase spawns 2, something tells me these aren't official names. Anyway, this phase spawns 2 red bishops. These guys levitate in place for a bit, then teleport to you and attack you with their swords. They're pretty easy to beat on their own, since you can stunlock them by repeatedly attacking. With 2 of them though, I kept on being killed by one of them while trying to stunlock the other. The trick here is to alternate between who you're attacking, since they take a while to move again after you hit them. So by constantly changing who you're attacking, it's pretty easy to kill them without taking too much damage. And after that, I'm able to quickly get to the boss without dying even once. The boss here is Benedicta of the Endless Orison. On my first playthrough of the game, I beat Benedicta on my first try, so I expected this fight to be pretty easy. Gosh, was I wrong. Benedicta's first phase has 3 main attacks. The first one is this attack where she attacks with lightning 3 times. This attack gives me a big opening to attack her, and isn't difficult to dodge at all. The second one is where she summons a Ciborium, either horizontally or vertically. This is also pretty easily avoided in most circumstances. Not too bad, right? Well, that's where her third attack comes in. With this attack, she summons 8 floating heads that home in on me. Dodging them isn't that much of a problem, since the walls actually work as portals, so I'll never get cornered. The real problem here is how they spawn. They spawn in a big circle, and instantly have a hitbox. They can also spawn in 2 places, either around Benedicta or around the Penitent one. Knowing where they spawn doesn't make it easier to dodge, though, since Benedicta can literally become invisible, and still cast spells while being so. If I'm careful enough, though, reaching phase 2 isn't too challenging. In this phase, she gains a new attack, where she summons a bunch of Ciboriums on the bottom of the arena, though this doesn't really make the fight any harder. What's more important is that her Ciborium attacks get upgraded, and become a much bigger problem. The horizontal one now has 2 more thrown, and the vertical one becomes a bit stronger. I can pretty much always avoid it by moving out of the way, but this attack becomes much worse in the last phase. Thankfully, the floating head attack remains the same, but it's the floating head attack. It's still the worst. The final phase, though, is where this fight truly turns into insanity. In this phase, Benedicta cuts down one of the elevators, and the other one moves to the middle of the arena. Because of this, I can no longer access the portals on the sides of the arena. The remaining elevator also periodically moves up and down, which makes it so that there is no guaranteed way to avoid the floating heads. Even if I might seem safe, the platform could still move up or down, making me get hit anyway. It gets worse, though. Benedicta's horizontal Ciborium throw becomes more difficult to dodge, with me having to duck under the first 2 and jump over the last one. The real issue arises once the platform moves to the top of the arena. If this happens, it's basically a coin flip if I take damage. If I jump to the upper platform, Benedicta can hit me by using her vertical Ciborium attack. And if I stay on the bottom, I'll get hit if she summons the floating heads. And no, destroying them doesn't always work either, since for some reason, after I break them, they can still hit me for a bit. At this point, every time the elevator reaches the highest point, I just need to pray I get lucky. There's probably something I could have done with the spawn locations of the floating heads, but if there was, I didn't find it. This phase alone also lasts around 7 minutes in total, so this happens many times. Oh yeah, guilt fragments also don't spawn here, so I don't get any extra health. There's more to this phase, but I think I've talked enough about this fight. You get the point, it's pretty difficult. But after 3 hours, I take down Benedicta of the Endless Orison. With Benedicta finally defeated, my next destination is the Sunken Cathedral. Before that, though, I have to pass through the Sea of Ink, where I encounter the boss. This isn't the actual fight, with him only having his first phase. It's still pretty difficult, though. At first, it feels basically impossible to know when you can hit him, but this fight becomes a lot easier when you figure out his patterns. For example, after he jumps into the air and lands on the ground, he's guaranteed to do either a halberd stab if you're in front of him, or a slash that sends out a wave if you're behind him. Both give you a pretty good amount of time to attack him. There's a bunch of these in the fight, and once you find him, the fight becomes a lot easier. After around 2 minutes of fighting, the boss flees, and I can continue to the Sunken Cathedral. This place isn't too difficult to get through, having no enemy challenge rooms. With that, I'm quickly able to make it to the boss, Odon of the Confraternity of Salt. This fight is identical to the previous encounter, but has a crucial difference. In this fight, Odon can summon minions to help him fight. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, you'll know that bosses doing this is really bad. If I can't defeat all of them before more spawn, it's basically a death sentence in most challenges. Luckily for me though, the devs actually thought of this. Odon can only summon more troops if there's none on screen in Phase 1, less than 2 in Phase 2, and less than 3 in Phase 3. Each time he does this, he summons 3 troops. Keeping this in mind, I can kill just enough troops so that he can't summon more, which makes the troops far less of a problem. This is still really annoying, but it's manageable, which wouldn't really be the case otherwise. Though, don't get the impression that the fight is easy. Odon is pretty much identical in the first phase, but in the subsequent phases, he gets a lot stronger. Pretty much every attack creates damaging waves by the end, which are pretty much a one-hit kill. The ones that don't get upgraded in a different way, like this spike attack activating more times. This fight is also even longer than the Benedicta fight, lasting around 15 minutes. It's manageable juggling all these attacks for a bit, but it's not easy doing it for such an extended period of time. Aside from all that, though, there's one thing in this fight that makes it easier than the previous encounter, with Odon getting this attack where he defends his troops. He's wide open when he does this, and I'm not killing his troops anyway. I really had a problem here of avoiding Odon as well as the troops, especially in the third phase, mostly because of stuff like this. But after around 2 hours of attempts, and a very boring fight, I managed to take Odon down. Four bosses left. Defeating Odon grants me access to the Severed Tower. I get Scion's protection here, which makes these handles appear, and I quickly make my way to the next boss. I'm sure this one won't be difficult. Gosh, how didn't I see that coming? So Sinodo swaps between different heads to perform his attacks, and most of them have a pretty easy strategy to avoid him. In the second phase, though, he gets this one, which summons a lot of projectiles. Now, I'd like to call myself good at avoiding these bullet hell attacks, but I could just not get the hang of this attack. The projectiles always spawn close to you, so you're forced to keep on moving around, which isn't very easy when this is around you. Also, these projectiles kill me in a couple hits, since my health bar looks like this. Turns out, though, I was overthinking this way too much. Remember this dashing attack my weapon has? I hope so, otherwise you might want to get that checked. But turns out it's pretty broken, especially for this fight. By just sitting in the corner, I can use this attack's extremely long period of invincibility to avoid any projectiles that get near me. As a nice bonus, the projectiles will sometimes spawn in the wall, so that's cool. And after around an hour and a half, I defeat Sinodo, Hymn of the Thousand Voices. At this point, I head back through the elevated temples, and into Two Moons. This area was something for sure. Oh, look at that, an enemy challenge room. This one happens to be the most difficult so far. The first phase isn't a problem. 3 of these whip-wielding enemies spawn, whose whips have great range and they can also shoot projectiles. But they aren't too difficult to deal with. The second phase is a bit harder. In this phase, 2 shield bearers, 1 blue incense hammer, and a yellow lamp spawn. All of these enemies are pretty easy to deal with on their own, but altogether they become really hard to deal with. The shield bearers throw these giant axes, which are surprisingly hard to avoid, the lamp shoots these fireballs, and the incense hammer shoots out a lightning bolt you need to dodge through. Dealing with all these enemies together is pretty much impossible, so instead I lure them away from each other and deal with them on their own, which works pretty well for the most part. The third phase is a lot easier, with everything being pretty easy to deal with. Phase 4 is the real problem. 2 more yellow lamps and 2 blue deathbed companions spawn here. There's so many projectiles that it feels like I'm back in the Sinodo fight, only this time I can't avoid my problems. It's super hard to kill anything in this phase, not only because of the sheer amount of projectiles, but also because the projectiles from the deathbed companions aren't destructible. The deathbed companions are also ridiculously bulky. On one of my attempts, though, I was able to kill one of the yellow lamps early, and the other one stayed on the other side of the arena. giving me time to kill a deathbed companion before the other reached me. With 2 enemies dead, I was able to deal with the rest pretty easily. Well, that's lucky. Hopefully there's not any more of those anytime soon. This one also took a while to beat, but turns out I didn't need to beat it anyway, since I just reached the other entrance to the area, so that's very cool. I soon reached this room, which teleports me to a copy of the area, but it's upside down, which I haven't seen, gosh, ever. And after 2 more relatively easy enemy rooms, I reached the next boss, which is maybe my least favorite fight exclusively because of this challenge. The boss here is Susona, Fermosa Fembra. Even for this challenge, my damage here is ridiculously low. I've also reached the point where literally anything will kill me, so guilt fragments are no longer useful. About this. Dropping guilt fragments increases a meter called guilt, which is a mechanic where you gain a smaller fervor bar, but more tears of atonement as it rises. I thought I didn't need to worry about having high guilt, since I'm not using prayers anyway, but turns out high guilt also drastically lowers your defense. So throughout the entire challenge, I'm making this way harder for myself than it needs to be. Consider it an extra way of making the challenge harder, for my sanity's sake. Anyway, back to the video. Let's get into the attacks. In Phase 1, the attack she uses the most is this one where she flies around the arena spawning energy balls. This is usually pretty easy to avoid, but it can sometimes catch me at the wall, and for whatever reason, I found them shockingly difficult to air dash through. After she does this, she usually performs a laser attack, which spawns these platforms you need to run under. The platform at this point is pretty big, so this isn't too much of a problem. Except the hitbox, which is a bit wonky. The final attack she has is where she sits on the ground, and will either shoot 3 lasers, or spawn a bunch of energy balls in a pattern. These are also pretty easy to avoid if you have good timing. Of course, Phase 1 is not where the problem is. Once I reach Phase 2, all of her attacks get upgraded, just like in the Benedicta fight. Firstly, her attack where she flies around gets a lot faster and harder to avoid. It's a lot more common that I get trapped in the corner. Her laser attack now only spawns 2 platforms, which makes it more difficult to dodge, but usually doesn't make that big of a difference. Her attack where she sits on the ground also gets upgraded, but it's still pretty easy to avoid. Now, this is already pretty difficult. Even if these attacks aren't that difficult to dodge, keep in mind that getting past these 2 phases takes around 5 minutes, and I can't afford to be hit by anything. But if I manage to get past all that, the 3rd phase is a nightmare. Of course, her flying attack becomes faster, with an even harder pattern. But that's not even the problem. Her laser attack changes from an inconvenience that sometimes catches me off guard, to the bane of my existence. The platform that spawns becomes even smaller than a singular platform, and if it spawns too far away, I need to do an extremely precise dodge or even a dash attack to have a chance of getting under in time. Too soon or too late, and it's a restart. Now, I feel like I have a pretty good reaction time, but this attack felt really unfair. The platform can spawn so close to her that I have basically no chance to react. She also now performs the attack multiple times in a row. It's hard enough to dodge it once, but having to do it 2 to 3 times in a row is just insane. And this gets used a lot in this phase. And no, there's no pattern to where the platform spawns. It's completely random. The sitting attack still sucks though. Nice to know some things don't change. Anyway, this fight took a while. But after many tries, and an 8-minute fight, I defeat Susona, Fermosa Fembra. And finally, we make it to the final area of Blasphemous II. With everything else beaten, I can proceed to Crimson Reigns. Crimson Reigns is by far the hardest area in the game. Not only does it have the strongest enemies, but also has 3 extremely long forced enemy rooms. There's also no more than 1 save point, instead having shortcuts after you beat certain areas. Now, near the beginning of the area, I encounter the Blue Bishop. These are identical to the red ones in the Basilica of Absent Faces, but are different in one way. They don't get stunned when you hit them. This changes them from a minor annoyance to the most dangerous enemy in the game. It's really hard to predict where they'll spawn, and they can also spawn on top of me, doing a solid chunk of my health. They also follow me around the area, so I can't just run away. Their weapon attack is also pretty much a one-shot, even if it doesn't fully bring down my health bar. On their own, though, they're manageable. Since their weapon attack is pretty slow, I'm able to react and attack them after they use it. Rinse and repeat. And soon enough, I reach my first challenge room. The first few phases on this one are actually pretty easy. The second and third phases killed me a couple times, but aren't really an issue. The fourth phase is a bit different. 2 blue bishops spawn here. Defeating 1 is already hard enough. Defeating 2 is just awful. Eventually, I realized that the bishop has a sound cue, specifically when it's going to attack. So whenever I hear it, I can dodge when I see the next bishop spawn to avoid their attack. It's still not easy, of course, since they can still spawn on me, and if they both attack at the same time, I can get hit by one bishop while trying to dodge the other. I pretty much just have to play really well, slowly lowering the bishop's health, while just praying I don't get screwed by them spawning on me. Taking down one of them is all I have to do, though. And after a close fight, I eventually beat this room. I don't get much of a break, though. The next challenge room is pretty much immediately after. This one seemed like it'd be really difficult, since in the second phase, a bunch of chandelier boneheads spawn, with this wraith throwing spears at me the whole time. Another blue bishop also spawns in the final phase. And to add insult to injury, getting hit near the edge here is an instant death. Surprisingly, though, I actually beat this area on my third try, which was almost certainly a fluke. Well, let's hope we can keep this going, since this final room is the hardest in the game. In this room, these crimson blood droplets perpetually fall, which damage me if I touch them. Their locations don't change, but they're still a problem when I'm trying to avoid a bunch of things at the same time. This room's first phase starts off with 2 more bishops and a red lamp. Thankfully, these bishops are the much weaker red ones, so I'm able to stunlock them. Phase 2 is a lot harder. 1 spear-throwing wraith and 2 deathbed companions spawn here. These red ones aren't as dangerous as the blue ones, each firing 1 fireball every few seconds. At this point, though, I am probably at low health, since the red bishops are still pretty hard to kill, even if they're not even close to as dangerous as the blue ones. None of the projectiles here are destructible either, aside from the Crimson Rain. I need to dodge everything that's sent my way. To have a chance here, I need to target the Wraith first. He's a lot less bulky than the Deathbed Companions, and getting rid of him makes the phase at least a third easier, I guess. By repeatedly jumping over the Deathbed Companions, I'm able to avoid a lot of the projectiles, and slowly take down the Wraith. If I'm able to before I'm killed, this phase becomes a lot easier, since the remaining enemies are far less of a threat. The third phase has 3 enemies, 2 weak grunt enemies, and a red Nightcaster. This phase is pretty much a copy from the one from the elevated temples, but this time without the teleporters. Once I take care of the grunts, the Nightcaster is pretty easy to beat, but it's easy to mess up. And once they're defeated, we proceed to the final phase. This phase just spawns 2 incense hammers. And with a bit of patience, we make it to the final boss of Blasphemous II.
For I am the first penitent, and you shall be the last.
Eviterno, first of the penitents, is the hardest boss in Blasphemous II, and it's not really all that close. On the other hand, it'd be a pretty fair fight if the hitboxes weren't so bad. Like, these are actually the worst hitboxes I've ever seen. Eviterno has 2 phases, with the first one being much easier than the second, just like most of the final bosses of Castlevania. Eviterno, first of the penitents, has him shooting fireballs and lightning bolts, both of them being pretty easy to dodge if you know what to do. This phase is annoying more than anything, since it gets pretty repetitive having to fight this guy for 2 minutes straight before getting to Eviterno Last Desecrator is Eviterno's second phase, and its difficulty isn't even comparable to the first. It's also 5 times as long, and of course, pretty much anything he does one-shots me. On the other hand, this fight is pretty refreshing in that he doesn't completely change his attacks in subsequent phases, instead just adding to what he can do. In the first phase, he only has 2 attacks. The first one is where he does a bunch of sword slashes, into a shockwave attack, into a final projectile. The second one is a jumping slash, which summons a bunch of fire pillars, and then goes into the first attack. Both of these give me pretty good windows to attack him, so phase 1 is pretty easy. Once he reaches 2/3 of his health, he gains 2 new abilities. Firstly, instead of doing the first attack, he can instead jump into the air, attack with a sword slash, and slam on the ground, summoning more fire pillars. Jumping away from Eviterno beats both these options, since it avoids the initial attack, and at that point you can just react to what he's doing. The second one is a huge slash with his sword that he can do after finishing other attacks. This is pretty scary looking, but it has a deceptively small hitbox, so I guess that makes up for the other ones. Also, by the way I dodged his attacks, I was in the air 99% of the time when he did this, making this attack pretty much a non-issue. If I manage to get him to 1/3 of his health, we reach the final phase, where he does probably the coolest attack in the series. And at this point, he becomes a lot more unpredictable. The biggest problem is this shockwave attack, which he can do at any time now, and is really hard to react to. It's so dangerous that I had to resort to always jumping when he has a chance to attack, just in case he does this. This fight is just like Odon, in that he's only difficult if you don't know what he can do, but becomes way easier once you learn the attack patterns. And after many tries, I defeat Eviterno, last Desecrator, in just under 2.5 hours. And that's it, right? Well, no. Remember when I said Eviterno was the final boss? Well, I lied. There's technically one fight left, but it's so easy. It shouldn't take long, and there's still 4 hours of footage left. Okay, well. Incarnate Devotion is, well, normally, an extremely easy boss. He's really frail, and all his attacks are easy to avoid. And for the most part, it's the same here. Except with one attack. One attack makes this the hardest fight in the game. You see, Incarnate Devotion has an attack where he becomes invincible, and summons 4 flowers which periodically shoot projectiles when you're not hitting him. You need to destroy all the flowers to remove the barrier protecting Incarnate Devotion's heart. There's a problem though. After you destroy a flower, if you don't destroy the rest in a certain amount of time, it'll respawn. This usually isn't an issue, since they're not very bulky. But this is the point where choosing Sarmiento and Centella finally catches up to me. With no stat boosts, it takes 10 hits for me to kill a single flower, which is more than enough time for one to respawn before I can break all of them. It's hard enough destroying them at all with everything sent my way, but this attack just felt like a solid wall. It's not over quite yet though. I did find one way to get past this attack. And no, it's not easy to perform or consistent. Since the flowers don't regain health when they're alive, I can attack a flower until it's one hit away from breaking, and then kill the flower adjacent to it. If I then kill the rest extremely quickly, I can just barely kill the final flower before another respawns. Usually, though, I'll be a bit too slow. So instead I starting out doing the same thing as before, but once I made it to the other side, I'd do it one more time, weakening one of the flowers before destroying him, and then killing the other flowers right after they respawn. I have more time to work with this way, but I have to avoid the projectiles for twice as long. Most of my deaths specifically came from trying to jump over the heart to the other side, which is difficult since I don't really have many options of where to land. And if I do manage to get past this attack, he'll do it at least 3 more times in the fight, and I still have to avoid everything else. This fight was something. Anyway, if you've seen my channel before, you probably saw this coming. and after 72 tries, I complete the entirety of Blasphemous II without any upgrades. And with that, yes, you can beat Blasphemous 2 without any upgrades. Eventually. Anyway, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe and all that stuff, because this video took like 50 hours to make, and gosh, nothing makes my dopamine receptors happier than that little number going up. Also, if this video gets, say, 40 likes, I'll do the same thing for a Blasphemous 1. Eventually. I might do it anyway though, because Konami's allergic to money apparently. Thanks for watching.